Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond. This is the fifth part of a five-part series. We're looking at No Time to Die, the final film of the Daniel Craig arc, and the film that cements the character's dramatic journey and what he's represented over all five films. The most important points in any story are its starting point and its ending. No Time to Die, in many ways, feels like it encapsulates much of what Bond was about at that very first point of Genesis in Casino Royale. Over the course of the series, I've explored an argument that Daniel Craig's Bond is bifurcated between the human being James Bond and the secret agent 007, an assassin, a murderer, as people will call him in this movie. And the tension between those two is really what's powering a lot of the dramatic back and forth across all of these movies. To be a government-sanctioned assassin and a murderer is a journey that can only lead to Bond's death. As Bond says at the start of Casino Royale, 00 agents have a very short life expectancy. He's signed up knowing that this is essentially a death sentence. And in order to escape that fate, he has to leave that behind. At the end of Spectre, he has successfully done this. He has put behind his role as 007. He has left the service of his own accord, as he did, again, in Casino Royale, briefly, with Vesper. And what we see play out at the start of No Time to Die is in many ways a direct revisitation of Casino Royale. It is yet another holiday in Italy with a woman James Bond loves. And in both cases, the past isn't done with that relationship. And what we watch unfold is Bond relive the trauma of apparent betrayal all over again. But as much as trauma is centric to Daniel Craig's James Bond and has been the through line across all of these movies, No Time to Die actually opens with the trauma focus being on Madeline. We open No Time to Die with a dramatic representation of a scene discussed in Spectre, and No Time to Die is very much Spectre Part 2. There is a very real sense in which No Time to Die takes Spectre very seriously as its preceding chapter. And you can't really separate understanding No Time to Die apart from what happened in Spectre. And Madeline has formative childhood trauma just like Bond, but her trauma is very much tied into the betrayal she's felt with her father figure being an assassin and a murderer, and the ramifications that has had for her life. And at the opening of No Time to Die, we see exactly what that is. The main villain of this film, Safin, appears at her family home, kills Madeline's mother, and hunts her in a sequence that is very much like a horror movie, sort of nightmare, tense suspense sequence. And one of the most important lines of dialogue, there are actually two separate lines of dialogue that refer to this, but is Madeline's mother revealing to Madeline that her father is an assassin. And that is, she tells her that her father kills people, and then she asks her a very pointed question: is that who you love? Murderers. That is kind of a lingering question for Madeline, and that has been something she was thinking about in Spectre, and it continues to be a dramatic issue for her in No Time to Die. She wants to leave the world of killers behind, but it's also the world the only world she understands, and she needs someone who understands that world in order to understand her. And that's why Bond is appealing to her. Bond is a parallel to her father, a father figure who could potentially put that behind him. In many ways, like Daniel Craig's Bond is the father she's trying to fix, a father who could put this behind him and be the protector that she really wanted her father to be. And this is where No Time to Die starts off. And I think it's often misunderstood as a moment that's purely about Madeline and Madeline's own trauma. But I think this is actually setting up an idea that's pretty clearly been established in the prior movies too, about Bond. And of course, it's also introducing Safin, who the movie will go to great pains to explicitly list as a mirror to James Bond. Safin will say, quite literally, in the movie, in this movie's version of we're not so different, you and I, scene where he's like, I could be looking at my own reflection, right? Safin is yet again another one of these characters with childhood trauma who is responding to childhood trauma in a very sinister and psychotic way, right, for Safin. We'll talk about Safin in a bit, but this is where the movie starts us. So it is pulling us right back into this idea that childhood trauma is central to these movies, and it really has been, right? Bond's orphaned child, like nature as an orphan, was seeded in Casino Royale. We have the parallel journey of Camille and her revenge in Quantum of Solace, with her quest to heal from her wounds of loss of family. We have Skyfall, which is all about Bond confronting his past as an orphan and coming to terms with that, and Spectre dealing with the aftershocks of that. And here at No Time to Die, it circles right back to that, and the ramifications of that kind of reverberate and continue to resound throughout the final chapter. So, having said that, let's talk about Bond himself in this movie. At the start of this movie, Bond is somewhat where he was at the end of Spectre. We're seeing Bond do real healing work for himself, right? He is making intentional strides to commit to this relationship, to deal with his own psychological baggage. Madeline is encouraging him to do that, and Bond is going to bid farewell to Vesper. This is an idea that is loosely adapted from Fleming, and in many ways, this sort of old man Bond trilogy of Skyfall, Spectre, and No Time to Die is a big remix of the latter-day Fleming books. Skyfall is pulling from The Man with the Golden Gun in particular. Spectre and No Time to Die are remixing elements of On Her Majesty's Secret Service and You Only Live Twice, right down to Bond fathering a child. And here we see Bond as kind of what he might be as a whole person. And it's interesting how costume design across this movie is playing with that idea. Bond's style has left sort of Britishness behind at the start of this movie. He's dressing in a more relaxed Italian style. The sartorial members of the Bond community can speak to the various details in which his wardrobe has shifted a little bit here. But we are also just getting a much softer, more romantic Bond. And he's more successfully so than he was in Casino Royale. The Bond who left with Vesper in Casino Royale felt like a person who didn't quite know what he wanted. This Bond feels much more secure. But we also see that all that baggage underneath is right there underneath the skin, and it comes back as soon as, in the very moment he's trying to bid farewell to the past, Blofeld has his revenge. And this sequence is in many ways a symbolic version of Tracy's death from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. In the Fleming novels and On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the film, Blofeld enacts revenge by killing the woman Bond loves, the woman Bond marries. In this version of the story, that death is effectively symbolic. Blofeld kills Madeleine for Vesper by framing her. It kills Madeleine for Bond by framing her as a new Vesper type, someone who betrayed Bond yet again. And we see how easily Bond falls back into the pattern of suspicion. And when he does, Bond goes right back to the death wish that has powered his character on and off throughout all of these movies, this sort of willingness to consign himself to death that we saw very early on in Casino Royale, and has kind of carried through. The potent moment in this opening sequence, and it's a quintessential Daniel Craig Bond moment, is when Bond is trapped in the car with Madeleine, and he just gives up the fight. He is just willing to let it all go, and he is willing to let them both die in the car, just letting Spectre pelt them with bullets, just completely given up. And it's a very good moment for Daniel Craig, and it's a very good moment for Léa Seydoux as she pleads that Bond do something. And Bond makes the choice that even though he doesn't trust Madeleine in this moment, he's going to do what he couldn't do for Vesper, and he's going to save her. And he puts Madeleine on a train, and he cuts himself off. And he cuts himself off from his life entirely after that moment. When he leaves Madeleine at the train station, he falls off the face of the earth for 5 years. We find out after, the movie kicks back up that he's been living in Jamaica, Jamaica being a key location for Ian Fleming. That's where Ian Fleming's house was. But Bond's relationship to Jamaica is different in this movie than Ian Fleming's relationship to Jamaica. This isn't some vacation home. Bond has been off the grid. He is effectively, playing dead, right? Lost to the world, and cut off in many ways from his Britishness. I think that's an important element of where No Time to Die frames the character, because what we see is, for the first time, we start to see a version of Bond. Prior four movies have posed this question of, who would Bond be if he gave up being a secret agent? And now we finally get to see it, and it's interesting what is consistent and what is not consistent about 007, this Bond who is no longer 007. He has given up a lot of the fancy clothes. He's keeping his nice suits in Britain alongside his Aston Martin, and he only really wears suits in this movie to go to the office. It's very much his secret agent uniform, as is the dinner jacket and tuxedo. He is wearing that to perform a mission. Again, it's reinforcing this idea that the nice things, the iconography of 007 is very much a uniform for this character. It's his bat suit, right? So he's kind of put that behind, but unlike Inspector, he has really built a nice home for himself. He's obviously invested a lot in that. He's doing a lot of fishing on a boat that's very much like the boat he was on at the end of Casino Royale with Vesper. There's a lot that's consistent about it, but it is interesting that the luxury facets of the character are a little bit diminished. And we've seen that with 5 years of not having to deal with the constant stress of death, that sort of inner death wish has subsided a bit. And I think that's the major explanation for why there's such a break in Daniel Craig's performance between the sequence that's in Matera and then 5 years later, how Bond is carrying himself differently. He's let go of a lot of stress, and I think it's fun to see this version of Bond, if only briefly, enjoying life, because I don't think we've ever really seen much in the prior 4 movies where Daniel Craig's James Bond is just really relaxed and enjoying life. And for a brief period of time in the early stages of No Time to Die, you get the sense of a Bond who is enjoying himself. And it's nice to see Daniel Craig do that, and it's nice to see Daniel Craig get to lean into the facets of this character who is no longer connected to the British government, who actually has a somewhat oppositional point of view. Now that he's on the outside, what actually pulls him back into the mission is the CIA reaching out to him and Bond concluding that the British government has done something wrong. So that brings us to talking about Ralph Fiennes' M a little bit here, because Ralph Fiennes' M is a major character in this movie, and he's been a major character over the past 2 movies too. And he is a government official who has come in to replace Dench's M in Skyfall. And whereas Dench's M had a very intimate relationship with Bond, they were kind of always co-conspirators against the broader bureaucracy of the British intelligence community. Ralph Fiennes' M is more representative of the British government. He is an institutional figure for Daniel Craig's James Bond, and we see that sort of opposition very strongly in this movie when Daniel Craig confronts Ralph Fiennes' M in the office for the first time. They've spoken in the phone before that, kind of antagonistically, and Bond is really contextualizing him in terms of the office. And Ralph Fiennes' M is the one who is, in many ways, responsible for the weapon that kills James Bond. He's created the Heracles project and has shepherded it for many years. Heracles is the super weapon of this story. It is the new equivalent of an atomic bomb that might change warfare for humanity forever. It allows governments and entities to target particular individuals based on genetic code. And this is an invention of the British government. It is an invention that is designed effectively to make a 00 agent obsolete. Why would you need a 00 agent if you have this super weapon? And in many ways, this is a story about Bond confronting what the British government has created to make him obsolete. And it destroys Bond in the end, and we'll talk about that. But that antagonism between Bond and M in this movie is very strongly felt because M is really the author of Bond's demise, and we see that Bond is really in the fight to begin with because he gets the sense that there's something wrong at MI6, that there isn't a player on the field who really understands the story, and he needs to get back into it. But as we've said, Craig Bond is caught between these two trajectories. He can either live his life, or he can pick the gun back up, and that means he will be back on the trajectory of being a secret agent, which means death is expected, it's imminent, and he picks the gun back up, and that kind of seals his doom. And we kind of get the first foreshadowing of that mortality with the death of Felix Leiter, and Felix Leiter even makes an offhand comment about wanting Bond to help him out so that he can return to his wife and kids, and Felix Leiter can't. And Bond will somewhat share Felix Leiter's fate. To be a secret agent is to be at risk of death, and eventually it's going to catch up with you, and in No Time to Die, it catches up with Bond. So having said that, let's talk about Safin a bit in this, because Safin is a very interesting figure in the scheme of these Daniel Craig Bond movies. not as fleshed out as he should be, but essentially he is the first truly irrationally psychotic villain of the Daniel Craig Bond era. All the villains in prior installments had very tangible, more rational motivations. Safin is a gothic horror character. He is the James Bond version of the Phantom of the Opera. He's introduced as a scarred man wearing a mask, obsessed with a beautiful girl. It's the Phantom of the Opera template. And he's been created as a result of horrific childhood trauma, losing his parents in a very, psychologically altering way. But his family is also a family of murderers. And he sees himself as carrying on that family legacy on a grand scale. His parents were poison creators. And Safin's identity is to essentially reclaim that legacy and take it forward. He's going to do one better. It's not going to be just toxins this time. It's going to be an altered version of Heracles that will change the face of warfare forever, that will launch it into essentially a version of nuclear warfare, but where it's, a nanovirus that attacks entire genetic strains. And one thing that I don't think is well understood about his endgame in this movie is there's not really a unique endgame scenario beyond him just setting himself up as the ultimate merchant of death. His ambition is just to be the greatest assassin for hire that ever was. He is giving the world the tools to kill each other on the greatest scale that you could possibly have. And that is a fairly wild idea, and I think it doesn't really get to sink in because Safin is just not in the movie very much. Much like his obsession with Madeline Swan, it's a very interesting, dramatic idea to have a Bond villain who is so obsessed with the leading Bond lady of the story. But Safin isn't in it enough for that dramatic hold to really take. And if this movie has a weak spot, I think it's really that. But it's interesting that is his mirror to Bond, and he's very clearly grouping himself and Bond together in that way, in the sense that we are both they're both bringers of death to the world. That's how Safin sees himself, as being connected to Bond. And again, that's reinforcing this idea that we've had in the Daniel Craig series, that Bond, to be and do what he does, is to be an agent of death, and that has a certain cost associated with it. Bond in this film, however, gets something Safin doesn't, and that is a true legacy. Safin is talking about how he thinks his legacy is his weapons. Bond's legacy is his child. This child is a loose idea that Fleming pulls from You Only Live Twice, where Bond fathers a child. In Ian Fleming's novels, Bond was never aware that he authored sired a child, but it's an important moment for the character there in terms of setting up a very tragic finale to Fleming's novel You Only Live Twice, which incidentally is my favorite of the Ian Fleming novels. I really like the dreamlike and bittersweet tragedy of that story. It's a very peculiar novel, but it's a very, very potent one in terms of its images. And this movie is pulling from it a lot in terms of the, references to the Garden of Death and things like that. All of that are lifted from Fleming's You Only Live Twice. And the child here is interesting in the sense that Bond is right after Bond has decided to go back into the service. He's even reappointed as a double O agent. Right after he's made that choice, he is confronted with the very real possibility of what it would have been like if he had never left Madeline at the train station, if he had really not let his fears get the worst of him at the start of this movie and had embraced that alternate life. He might have been a father and presumably a husband, or at least a supporting partner to Madeline. And in the end, what he has to choose to do is to destroy himself, because he himself becomes the weapon. That's kind of like a symbolic move that this movie makes in getting infected with Heracles, the virus. Bond becomes a weapon himself, right? He is a weapon that can then directly harm his family. And that, I think, is the big symbolic idea of this finale. That is why, dramatically in this movie, Bond has to die. It's kind of Bond has to die so that what he loves will live. We kind of see what happens where, what is it Dominic Green says in Quantum of Solace? Everything he touches seems to wither and die. That is kind of Bond's curse, insofar as he is an agent of death. And there's something inside him that is just directly tied to it. And there's one moment in this movie in particular that brings that up. We've talked over the course of this series about how this Bond in particular, has a sort of like unstable rage, a proclivity to violence that is very different than that of his predecessors, who were just more professionals in this dark line of work. But Bond here has like a sort of unstable ability to snap. And where this movie really brings that to the forefront is when he's talking to Blofeld, who appears in this movie for a brief, almost cameo role. But in this role, Bond sort of snaps, right? Blofeld gets under his skin, and Bond, almost like unprovoked in any physical sense, tries to strangle Blofeld, right? It's a pretty sudden, jarring, chilling move, but it shows just how much of this is innate to Daniel Craig's Bond. And it's telling that in the story that is actually the first moment Bond has become infected with the Heracles virus, right? Bond goes to strangle Blofeld. He pulls himself back, but Blofeld is effectively dead. It's setting up this symbolic relationship between Bond and Heracles. Heracles, after all, is the virus that would replace all 00 agents. It is the ultimate, most weaponized, most merciless version of a 00 assassin. It is the perfect killer, as the movie is setting it up. And it is therefore kind of a symbolic representation of the violence that lurks in Bond himself. And in the end, Bond has to let himself be destroyed alongside Heracles, that his family might survive him. That, I think, is ultimately the thematic resolution of the Daniel Craig era. And it feels like, regardless of what you feel about it, it is a sort of intentionally a bit of a downer ending. Daniel Craig's Bond, tastes happiness and then has it yanked away from him. There's kind of a bitter irony there, but it is the resolution of this tension between this character up until this point. And it is a moment where the character dies with a greater sense of purpose than he would have had before, a more personal sense of purpose. It is a very intentional act of sacrifice. It's not just him enacting his role as a government assassin out of duty, but it making a very direct choice on behalf of his family and their future that he allows himself to be destroyed. Now, that said, that you know, that has obviously been a very controversial move for the series. And I would also say, I think that as much as I've laid out, I think thematically what's going on there, I think there are some weird logistical issues, especially with the third act of this movie, where Safin in particular and his engagements with Bond are a bit sticky and don't always land with the force of dramatic weight that you wish they would. But nevertheless, I think as we look back on these 5 movies, they've looped through the same themes over and over again. There is a very clear, consistent idea of who this character is, who Bond is, how he behaves, what his core dramatic tension is, that I think consistently carries through these 5 movies, regardless of what you feel about this era, and gives it the feeling of, despite its sort of inconsistent sort of like narrative looping structure, a thematic consistency about what's lurking underneath the surface. And I want to give the Daniel Craig era credit for that. It's a very unusual experiment in the series of the Bond franchise. It set out with the mission to reinvent Bond forever, and it ended on a very big swing, effectively closing the chapter on this version of the character. So we'll have to see what version of the character comes forth in the future. I think this particular version of the character and its focus on these particular sets of issues will probably be unique to Daniel Craig's Bond. And so in that way, I reflect back on the Daniel Craig era and think this was a very fascinating and intriguing and mostly coherent exercise in defining who the character, what this version of James Bond would be and what would drive him. So that concludes this series. By all means, I look forward to your contributions in the comments. I look forward to your suggestions about things I should tackle next. One of the things I am debating doing is a series like this for the Pierce Brosnan era. Somebody suggested that in the comments. I think that might be an interesting alternative perspective to this, because the Daniel Craig era is so particular. And the Pierce Brosnan era is interesting in a lot of ways. I think in many ways it foreshadowed a lot of the narrative ideas that the Daniel Craig era would explore, but it does it in its own way, a way that's a lot more consistent with the films that came before it. So that might be my next adventure. Let me know what you think about that. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one.